Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. And I'd like to welcome you all to the next event in our Aerospace Nation speaker series. Our guest today is Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. He's the director of the Department of Defense's Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Jack's mission is to accelerate delivery of AI-enabled capabilities that will give America's warfighters critical advantages over our potential adversaries. Jack previously served as the Director for Defense Intelligence Warfighter Support in Office of Secretary of Defense. He was a commander of the 25th Air Force, where he led 30,000 personnel conducting intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations, and in other positions in the Joint Staff, the U.S. Pacific Command, and OSD. Jack, it's a real pleasure to have a leader and a good friend with your experience join us to talk about AI, which I believe will revolutionize, and I don't say that word lightly, how our military operates in the future. I'd like to start by giving you the opportunity to make a few opening remarks on progress toward developing AI-enabled capabilities, challenges that you're addressing, and perhaps some of your top priorities. So you've got the stick.
All right, thanks, Dave. Well, it's good morning to everybody, and it is an honor to join you for this leadership conversation. And in these times that are a little bit uncertain and trying, that are affecting all of us in many different ways. But for the conversation today, it's an honor for me as I'm sitting here on terminal leave, getting ready to exit after just about 36 years in the United States Air Force. But the conversation is about AI, and that's where I want to start in terms of artificial intelligence impact. It is my conviction and my deep passion that AI will transform the character of warfare in the Department of Defense in the course of the next 20 years. There is no part of the department that will not be impacted by this, from the back office to the battlefield, and as I like to say, from undersea to cyberspace and outer space, and all points in between. Everything could be made better through the application of AI, in a broad term with a lot of subsets to it. Yet, we've been watching this transformation unfold before us over the last, I say 10 years in earnest, but even longer than that. It's been happening in commercial industry, yet in the Department of Defense, we've been stuck in first gear. And I say that it's about first gear in terms of fielding. What the department has struggled with and wrestled with for the last few years is how to take the world's best AI R&D, bring it across that so-called technology valley of death, and field it at speed and at scale. And that's what we haven't been able to do yet. That was the basis for standing up Project Maven, also known under Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work as the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team. The words were not accidental. I mean, the future of algorithmic warfare and algorithm against algorithm. But based on the lessons we learned from Maven and showing that as challenging as that was to get that up off the ground and delivering capabilities, there was reality that we needed to apply to the rest of the Department of Defense. It could be done. You could make a difference in fielding AI well beyond the Intel enterprise. And that was the basis for standing up the Joint AI Center, or the JAIC, with a mission set that's quite simple: to scale AI and its impact across the Department of Defense. And so in the 18 months that I've been in the seat, I'd say we've put all the foundational elements in place, and I'll talk more about that throughout the rest of the presentation. But in a lot of ways, I'm incredibly proud, despite the strong and I would say stiff and never-ending bureaucratic headwinds we faced in doing this. For all of you who've spent any time, you particular, Dave, you've been in the Pentagon, taking an organization that was in June 2018, 4 volunteers with no money, and a couple of cubicles in different spots to work out of, to where we are today is 185 people with a $1.3 billion budget across the FIDIP. We've grown so fast that we've exceeded our current spaces and we're moving into a separate facility. All of that's happened in 18 months. For the Department of Defense, that's about as fast as a growth curve as you could possibly imagine. But we were laser focused on this idea of building those elements out and learning what it takes to deliver AI at scale. And kind of 3 really broad categories. One is mission initiatives, delivering AI capabilities for somebody, not for our own purposes, but for a combatant command or a military service or some other component. Number two is kind of going after those long lead items, which we're going to talk more about in things like JADC2. What does it take to really scale AI? So this thing called the Joint Common Foundation, an AI ML DevSecOps environment, which is a very simple term for a lot more that would be under the hood. And the third piece, which is important as anything else, is the idea of AI governance. Strategy, policy, AI ethics, international engagement, protecting counter adversarial AI, test and evaluation, on and on and on. What we've done in the JAIC is bring all those elements together in one organization with a focus on a very commercial sounding acronym of IPTs, Integrated Product Teams. And we've done that for Project Salus, which some of those listening have heard about the work we're doing with Northcom and the Guard for coronavirus 19 response. But by showing that we could do all this simultaneously as opposed to sequentially, we could go after the strategy and policy review of our data sources. We could work on what it took to put data into a platform in an enclave and do some work against it while also engaging with the users on things like user interface, user experience, while also doing test and evaluation. In the department, those tend to happen in very different places, and sometimes they don't happen at all. By putting them together in one organization, I think we get the best of all of this, which allows us to begin to scale and accelerate other programs across the services, which is another key part of what we're trying to do. As I say, work ourselves out of a job. Now, does that happen in 5 years, 8 years, 10 years? I don't know. But as you're most familiar with ISR task force, what does it take to get rid of it? Well, that means it has to be in the fabric of the department. It has to be part of what we do every single day is we just do AI. We don't even call it AI. We don't call Gary Kasparov's, Deep Blue back then is expert systems that he faced. They don't call that AI anymore. Back then, that was sort of cutting edge AI. So the mission initiatives we're focused on right now, we started with lower consequence, lower risk missions, predictive maintenance, HADR, defensive cyber, warfighter health, business process transformation, which is not really AI per se, sets a foundation for great AI in the future, and is also a shorter term return on investment. And then the one I would say is our priority, and this is the one I'm leaving with as kind of proud parent of that will accelerate over the course of the next couple of years, is joint warfighting operations. Really core to your heart, core to all of us is what can we bring AI to make a difference for the Department of Defense in our core warfighting operations. So that's sort of where we stand today. So the foundational elements are now in place. What we have to do in the course of the next 1 to 2 years is deliver. All right, this is about delivery first and foremost. It's a great slide deck or a pitch deck, to use a commercial term. But what we have to do is show that we're making a difference as a board of directors on the Hill, as a board of directors in Cape and other places in the building. We have got to show real delivery for the Department of Defense. And as I depart, we don't have another 3-star that's been confirmed or even officially nominated yet. So that will take a couple of months. But in the interim, I am thrilled that our Chief Technology Officer, Nan Mulchandani, over 26 years of experience in Silicon Valley doing this for a living in software companies, will be the acting director. And he transformed the organization from the moment he showed up, and he's intently focused on JADC2, looking at it from a different lens of a software company CEO. And then he'll take it until the new 3-star is confirmed, and then he'll fall back to that CTO role that he's been playing so incredibly well up to this point. So that's sort of the state of affairs that took us to this point.
Well, thanks very much for the insights, Jack, and also for everything that the men and women of the Joint AI Center are doing. So let's dig a little bit deeper on progress toward mature AI-enabled systems. But before doing so, I'd like to take advantage of your prior experience in the Air Force's ISR organization and ask a couple of questions on what's been learned so far from its integration of the A2 with the A6. As many of our listeners know, Headquarters Air Force combined its ISR organization, the A2, with its command and control communications organization, A6, under a single Deputy Chief of Staff for ISR and cyber effects operations. Could you speak a little bit to the impact this unified organization has had so far on the joint community?
Yeah, a little bit. So I'm gonna begin to answer that question. I'm gonna pivot to talk about what I think is even more significant organizational transformation that the Air Force has embarked on down in San Antonio, which you're very familiar with. You and I had a number of conversations about the future of the old Air Force ISR agency. But to the A2 and A6, you know, it's sort of that idea of taking two very different tribes and bringing them together. Not easy to do, and invariably ends up with a little bit of a clash of cultures. But what I thought the Air Force did very well in doing this with General Dash Jameson at the time and Lieutenant General B.J. Schwedo working together is taking the more core IT network comm pieces, bringing those out and giving those to Bill Marion as the Air Force CIO. And Bill and I worked pretty closely together when he was working with Dana Deasy as the OSD Chief Information Officer on digital modernization. So by taking that and putting under Bill, I think he got to focus on those big issues that we need to focus on for digital modernization. But at the same time, the cyber effects piece of that and putting it with ISR resulted in a very powerful combination of sort of non-kinetic effects, or broadly speaking. And I think that's still playing out as we speak. But what you're seeing up there now, after Mary O'Brien is on board, trying to bring in the best of the best in terms of the cyber expertise into the staff, as well as the ISR and intel expertise, because you really need both. You can't expect those in the ISR field to understand really deeply on all the cyber pieces of it. Although coming from a SIGINT background, you usually have a pretty good understanding of a lot of aspects of cyber. And likewise, if you've grown up sort of in that cyber and IT community, it's a little hard to grasp the magnitude of the Air Force Intel and ISR enterprise. So I think that's going very well in that respect. But let me, as I said, pivot down to San Antonio. I was calling for this 5 years ago, but like any big transformation, there's a period of time it takes to culturally accept that level of change. But by taking 24th and 25th Air Forces and bring them together under a single NAF commander in the form of Lieutenant General Tim Hawk, to me, that is the biggest transformation the Air Force has done in a long time, because it puts all that non-kinetic capabilities together in a single numbered Air Force commander. Now, I think you could logically ask the next step, as you and I would readily agree, is maybe a major command status. I won't pretend to answer for the chief or the secretary on what they envision 5 years down the road, but this gets it started. The idea of ISR, flying ISR, as well as sort of SIGINT, space-based, and all the other forms that we get intel off of, plus information operations and military information operations, or MISO, plus EW, plus cyber, offensive cyber, defensive cyber, cyber for the Joint Force, cyber for the CFAC or JFAC, all of that in the form of one commander. One, it's a daunting task for Tim, but I don't know of anybody in the United States Air Force, and having known Tim for a number of years, having worked very closely with him and as my vice down in San Antonio, there's nobody that better represents the entirety of the Air Force as opposed to a tribal approach of he's an ISR person or he's a cyber person. He's both. His experience with JTF Ares over in counter ISIS fight, as well as his extensive background in ISR, makes him actually the perfect person. And little known about Tim is he goes back a few years and working some pretty creative special programs on IO back in the days of sort of Serbia and Kosovo, and just about, that's all I can say about that. But I don't know of anybody who's ever met Tim that says anything other. That is the person that can drive the Air Force in the right direction with ACC.
Well, listen, thanks for that. And I think your remarks are spot on. There were some of us who were calling for a stand-up of a major command for cyber ISR, information command, vigilance command, whatever you'd like to name it, over a decade ago, which just goes to show how slow things progress inside our military. But you're spot on. 16th Air Force under Tim's command is hopefully the next step, the last step before the Air Force decides to stand up a functional command for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, information, and cyber. So let's move on from there. The Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, it's at the center of the DOD's development of a joint all-domain command and control architecture. Could you give us your perspective on some of the key elements that have to be addressed in order to realize this JADC2 vision?
Yeah, there's so much there that I could spend the entire hour just talking about that one. So let me. I've been thinking hard about sort of JADC2 in the last year of my time at the JAIC, and maybe the best starting point is to look at what the mindset change has to be before you get into the architectural mechanics of JADC2. And the mindset shift, which you've been talking about for a while, is the idea of moving the Department of Defense from this industrial age, hardware-driven force to an information age, software-driven, and more risk-tolerant one, and choosing where to take those risks and how to take that risk. If you accept that as a starting point, then I'd say the next piece or the next mindset change that would be required is look at the Department of Defense as a software company. People cringe a little bit when they hear that. I mean, we're in the business of war and destroying and rebuilding and all those other things. But the idea of a mindset of a software company, and what does a software stack look like? So once you start making that mindset shift, and you bring in someone like Nanmal Chandani, who's done this as a CEO of software companies, you begin to build out what the architecture should really look like. And think of, without getting into technical details, because I am not the technical expert, but I understand enough about it by now to draw the picture. And that is sort of infrastructure as a service. We need an enterprise cloud for 100 different reasons. Whether you want to get into a Jedi discussion, it doesn't bother me. It's just really in enterprise cloud for elastic computing, size, and global ability to put software updates, whatever it is. Then a platform as a service above that. And then a services layer, an application level or layer, and then APIs that will allow anybody to come in, get access to the tools, the data, the frameworks they need, and to build whatever they need. What does it take to build that? That's hard. That's hard because we were not built as a department, as a software company. We're dealing with 60 years of legacy systems, legacy workflows, legacy talent management. You can't just bolt those cutting edge technologies onto legacy equipment and expect to transform the Department of Defense. This is why I don't want to say existential. That maybe is a little bit too dramatic, but it's as big as anything else we have to do right now. And how do we get there? And I remember talking to Lieutenant General B.J. Schweda, who is the Joint Staff J6, and he's got this memo that tasked him with JADC2 architecture. I said, BJ, we've been trying to do everything in that memo for 40 years, and nobody's been able to pull it off. And he says, well, yeah, but I'm BJ. I'll figure this out. And BJ, he means that. Yeah, but this is bigger than any one person could possibly take on. So I go back to a more fundamental level. So you're going to build this architecture using sort of a software company mindset. But as I've found just in working all of our AI projects, it's the 4 common problems: data, culture, talent management, and then what I call product management. And so building an architecture is sort of an IT network piece, but you've got to have taking into account those 4 aspects of it. And I say that when I say talent management and sort of data and culture, it is building towards an AI-ready DOD, AI-ready workforce, and an AI-ready weapons system. So there has to be a lot of foundational work going on right now about what do we mean when we say data? Is it data standards, or is it really data formatting? And is it, hey, just give me whatever data it is, we'll have APIs that you can write against that, and we'll figure it out, which is a very commercial industry approach. They don't get caught up in this idea of data standards and be zealots about the standards piece of it. There's a different approach to this. Is one, we have to play the data as it lies in the world we exist today. But I think more important for me, more important for the department, is defining what AI ready means in the future. If you talk to General Hyten, he looks at his role as the Joint Requirements Oversight Council chairman as somebody that can make a big change in the DOD by forcing some of these requirements out there and say, this is what we must build towards. This is what AI ready generally means. And you know some of this has been done in CMC West Coast, and you're familiar with some other examples at different levels that we won't get into here. So that's kind of my starting point on this, but I'll also say that there's sort of these aspects of digital modernization that need to be addressed simultaneously. People ask, why did the JAIC end up under the DOD CIO? There is no better place right now because of the individual as this CIO in the form of Dana Deasy, who comes from business, right? He's not a former government employee, he's never time in uniform, but he understands warfighter requirements like nobody I've ever met that's been out of a uniform. And his focus was on the elements of digital modernization. Think AI, cyber, C3, cloud, and data. Data's just got to be there forever. So as a result of the last NDAA, he is absorbing the CDO, the Chief Data Officer function, coming over from another part of the department called Chief Management Officer into the CIO, and it'll be laser focused on warfighting data requirements. That is a great start. This is going to be a hard thing to work through because that CDO is going to have more on that plate than anybody is trying to fix just the core elements. But it really is, if you just think of this as, Dana likes to talk about digital modernization. I like to translate that into warfighting modernization. If we get this right and we take a software company mindset and we think about information-centric environment, it puts us on the right path towards that JADC2 world that you're talking about.
Very good, and you're right. This is a topic that could consume the entire hour plus more. Let me ask you one more related question on JADC2. While each of the services have a stake in the success of it, in seeing JADC2 succeed, each service approaches this a little bit differently. And for that matter, they approach multi-domain operations a little differently. And there's some question about the degree of commitment toward JADC2 by each of the services. Could you share your thoughts on the service's individual commitments to making JADC2 a reality?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And what we want to prevent happening is back to sort of parochial discussions of we have the right answer and another service doesn't. The beauty of doing everything I just talked about, sort of that software company mindset, is it shouldn't matter. You can accommodate every service's requirement built on the same foundation, and then the services can tailor their requirements for service needs. That's the beauty of this. That's a little hard for people to understand, is that you could call it multi-domain operations for the Army and ABMS for the United States Air Force, but if you build it correctly, it can meet all of those requirements simultaneously. So I think they're still working through what do we mean by that. And so it's sort of a promise right now. But they want to see their requirements reflected in that future of JADC2. I'm convinced it's not only doable, it's the only way to do it is build that stack out, that software stack the way I talked about. And if the Army has an Army requirement, it adds that in, the Air Force adds in, it becomes very, the same way, I'll use the term they use in commercial industry for software these days, is containerized. I can pull it out of one cloud and move it to another cloud because it's containerized. Same instance here. Maybe it's an apps future in which the Army has this long-range precision fires requirement and the soldier out in the battle space needs this to happen. Well, you can write to that. And it still fits on top of the JADC2 architecture. I realize that's more of a promise than a reality right now. We've got to get to the reality of it. But by accommodating all the services simultaneously, it'll be in so much better shape. And the good news is what we're trying to do in the JAIC. Like, I'm agnostic to any service-specific requirement. What I find is each service is making now, I call substantial progress in some element of all-domain command and control. What they don't have a lot of is AI-enabled solutions. So I want to stitch seams together of all those service programs and bring AI-enabled solutions that are fungible across any service depending on what they're using. So we have built, and some of this is just playing out in the last few months, but what we've built in the last year are relationships with the Air Force on AFWIC, Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office with Waldo, of course with Will Roper and SAF-AQ, with AFRL and some of their autonomous systems of the future on AACO that they're thinking about, on Army long-range precision fires, and now working with the 18th Airborne Corps on cognitive assistance to go faster through the sort of targeting cycle, and now with the Navy with a program called Clutch Shot at a classified level. I can't say a whole lot more than that. But now we've got 3 services invested with us and us invested with them to find ways to bring AI-enabled solutions to their big command and control problems. I'm excited about this. This is going to be a hard thing to go after, but this is why I said joint warfighting operations are the focus of the JAIC over the next couple of years for this, to go after these elements, which are not at all simple ones to tackle.
Well, thanks for that. One of the JAIC's missions is focused on AI that could help defend U.S. critical infrastructure from malicious cyber activity. Could you speak a bit about how will offensive and defensive cyber operations be integrated into JADC2 to keep communications resilient, protected, and secure?
Yeah, you can't look at a future of the department in cyber without introducing artificial intelligence and machine learning, mostly machine learning, some some elements of natural language processing. And why I say that is because the speed of this, back to the term algorithmic warfare, the speed of this will be so fast. If we're talking OODA loops and decision cycles, how do I stay in a decision cycle that's tighter than my adversary? And in cyber, we're watching this play out in every single day this is happening. You know, we're not at war with other countries, but we are in an information war environment in cyberspace. And you're just not going to be able to keep up with sort of human, or even in some aspects human-machine. We've got to get to machine to be able to react very quickly to cyber attacks and then counterattack. So there's a policy element of this which I have to set aside. And that's a very separate discussion, and a lot of progress has been made on this since I was the Joint Staff J39 in 2011, really dealing with some of these issues for the first time on the policy side and rules of engagement. But on the technical side, what is the adversary doing to us, and what can we do very quickly in return? Turns out to be great on paper, a lot harder to do. A lot of commercial capabilities is advertised to solve the DoD's problem, but all those solutions aren't as quite what they made out to be. Why? There's proprietary aspects of it. They need to be on site with us. But turns out we have our own challenges in the department. Over 24 cybersecurity service providers do things a slightly different way. So when one company comes in from the outside and gives us a quote unquote solution to our cyber defense problems, it turns out it solves one problem, not the other 23 cybersecurity service providers. So just getting to the idea of what does right look like across all the different CSSPs, what does data formatting need to look like so everybody understands where a starting point, what should be the composition of some of these cyber teams. Really interesting to watch this play out, as I knew that would happen when they stood up. They've matured. They're now talking about things like analytics support officers and cyber data engineers, replacing sort of some other people on those teams to focus on the data piece of it and how quickly can we move. So I think this is an area of most interest to us over the next couple of years. There are a lot of commercial solutions, also a lot of good solutions in places like NSA, but it's bringing those in and offering up the entire department so they're not stovepiped in one unit, one organization somewhere. And then once we get past the defensive piece, protecting our network, understanding what network mapping is, what incident detection can do, what unauthorized user activity monitoring can do. We're starting to see good examples of that well beyond the JAIC and the services. Now what does offensive look like? I think that's the big growth over the course of the next year to 2 years is now how do we take that great work we've learned the lessons from on the defensive side and shift to an offensive mentality, which brings in a lot of policy questions in.
Right. Oh, thanks for that insight. And hopefully we've moved cyber from an annex in our war plans to an integrated element of the entirety of what we plan to do. Mm-hmm. Let's switch a bit to focusing on JADC2 resource issues for a bit. We've all seen cases where service or joint initiative failed due to the lack of broadband support and inadequate resources. And now JADC2 is not a traditional program to build a major weapon system such as a ship or an aircraft. And this, and you're well aware of this, it can lead to concerns on the part of those who conduct oversight and approve funding for DoD acquisition programs. So, and you know, it's a euphemism for Congress. What are your thoughts on the most effective way, the secret sauce, if you will, to explain JADC2 and its importance to folks on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, and I actually live the analog of this with AI every single day. It's really the same kind of approach, which is we're trying to talk about a department that's a very different department. And I have struggled with this as a JAIC, trying to go up to the Hill in certain parts of the Hill and say, you know, you're asking for a level of detail in fiscal year 23 about what I'm spending on in technology. I am not certain what 6 months looks like. I can't promise you I know it. In fact, I say this, and I'm not really being tongue-in-cheek or glib about this. I say, if I tell you what I'm doing exactly for the dollar amount in fiscal year 23, you got to fire me because I'm lying to you, because I don't know how fast technology is going to adapt between now and then. But sure, that's incumbent upon us to tell the right story. It's the same thing that I know Will Roper's trying to do on JADC2 and ABMS, and others are trying to do. Army Futures Command sort of has that same dilemma of going up and saying, how do I translate PowerPoint deep ideas into trust me. And it's a hard thing, right? So the department sometimes doesn't have a great track record on the trust side. So what I always say is hold us accountable. If I can't tell you exactly what that dollar amount is, but you can hold me accountable for delivery of product. But beyond that, I think it really is a ground game of going up there and engaging with staffers and members over and over again to get them comfortable. And we haven't been great at that in the Department of Defense. We've got somebody now on board that she was a former staffer and she understands the world. And she said, we're nuts to avoid going up there. Instead of saying, treat them like the adversary. These can be our friends in court. I have never had a more bipartisan issue in my time in uniform. Everybody wants the DOD and AI to succeed. And I think it's the same with JAIC too, but it's in the show me. It's the Missouri slogan. You've got to show me something. So I think what we're going to have to do is show it incrementally. Go little victories, little a bit at a time, while still talking about the grand vision. But then bring people with real experience in the commercial world who have credibility in that world and say, no, this is the right approach. And let me tell you what we're going to do to make this work over the course of the next year. And I'll tell you what, we'll come back on IPRs with you every 4 months, every 6 months, every 2 months. And build that relationship with Congress that sometimes hasn't been as strong as it needs to be, because they do need to be convinced, and it's incumbent upon the department to get them there. I can't blame them for asking really hard questions when they keep hearing this term AI or JADC2 and really want to see what it's about. I know you have Will Roper coming up, and he's going to probably talk a lot more about this, but that's what he's trying to do is get people to understand a vision that is a different vision than traditional Department of Defense.
Very good. Now, we've all heard claims about how artificial intelligence is going to reshape the ways and means our warfighters are conduct future operations. But beyond the how and the what, and I'm not asking specifically about 2023, but could you describe the when in the context of how this is going to unfold? I mean, do you think AI is going to lead to a rapid, dramatic transformation that cross-cuts the entire defense enterprise? Or do you think changes are going to be more gradual and incremental?
So the best way I think about this is it won't be a miraculous sort of leap of faith. However, I do believe I'm the strongest possible believer in the technology S-curve. And the saying by a lot of other people well before me, we tend to overestimate the impacts of technology in the short term, underestimate those impacts in the long term. I believe that's where we are in AI. We're sort of in that. So there was a very sharp curve for a few years, and then we got into an AI winter, and then the winter recovered, and then went back into another winter. So we've gone through these little peaks and valleys. We're now in a little bit more of that sort of flatter slope of that S-curve. I do believe we're going to hit that inflection point, and the exponential growth of this will happen, and happen faster than probably a lot of people understand right now. However, that won't happen just by itself. When I go back to digital modernization, we've got to build the foundational elements. You could always, and we used to have these discussions in Maven, hey, this technology is still pretty brittle. It's pretty fragile. Shouldn't we just wait a little bit while and wait till technology is better? No, the absolute worst answer is stop and wait for technology to catch up. You've got to learn how to do it. What we learned about what it took to go from data curation to integration into a weapon system and sustain an algorithm every couple of weeks over the course of the next 5 or 10 years was so valuable in learning what it takes to bring AI into the department. You had to get started. So you've got to build those foundational elements. The CDO is going to have a role in this, General Schrader and his role as the J6, all of this is going to come together. But without that, the technology S-curve not only stays flat, I think it actually begins to go down. As we learned with Maven, you take these pretty good computer vision capabilities that are cutting edge for today, but you're bolting them onto the weapon system so well, Air Force Distributed Common Ground System or Army DCGS, and they're legacy systems in so many ways, and you plateau performance. You can't do that anymore, so you've got to kind of build towards that AI-ready future. If we get those foundational elements right, I do believe, this is more of a belief than any assertion on my part, is we will get up that S-curve and it will go very quick and probably surprise us. If I would say I'd be critical of myself, I'm maybe a little jaundiced because I know how brittle things are today, this fragility of AI in general. So maybe I don't quite even understand how quick it will jump up that S-curve. but we have to look at the department differently than we're used to looking at to get us up that S curve. And I just don't know. You know, you ask a question, I don't think there's any great simple answer, but 2025 to 2030 sounds about right to me. And there's this book, it's a fascinating book called Architects of AI chapters by the 50 people in the world who helped kind of build AI to what it is today. And the question they ask every one of those world-renowned experts on AI is, when do you think artificial general intelligence will happen, or AGI? The answers range from 20 years to never. These are the best in the world, and they can't come to anywhere close to an agreement on AGI. So that's the world we're in today. Technology is unfolding so fast, I think it's just going to catch us off guard when all of a sudden, wow, we fundamentally changed the department. But that also requires, last thing I'll say about this, it's not just bringing in new technology. You have been an advocate of what I'm about to say for all that you've been in the military and outside the military. What do the operating concept that you're building with the technology? Technology by itself is just technology. Our inherent advantage, we have many still over the Chinese and Russians, but I think our inherent advantage will remain for a long time to come, is the idea of coming up with operating concepts around things like AI, 5G, blockchain, cloud, and eventually maybe quantum. Is a little farther out, but even that could surprise us in how quickly it comes. So the idea of give the capabilities to the warfighter. I'm not the innovation organization in the Department of Defense, right? I'm building a joint AI center. The innovators at the tactical edge will figure out, like they've done in every conflict in history, how to use it the right way.
Outstanding. Now, let's expand a little deeper in how AI affects other elements. We know it's the glue that will integrate the operations of other emerging technology advances, such as hypersonic weapons, next generation uninhabited aircraft. Could you address a bit how AI might have an impact on these emerging systems, perhaps by citing an example?
Yeah, I think as I said at the very beginning, I don't know of an element of the department that won't be improved or enhanced with AI-enabled capabilities. But it requires working your way through a series of questions about which ones do you actually take on. And in the series of questions, we've kind of got that almost down to a checklist at this point. What are you trying to solve? Do you have data that would allow an AI solution even to be feasible? What's the return on investment? Is it worth the expenditure on it? If it costs you $200 billion and you're up against $40,000 quadcopter equivalent, it's a losing proposition. And then, is it applicable against to the entire joint force? Does it align with the priorities of the national defense strategy? So you work your way through these series of questions, but I believe some of the next big steps of this is our autonomous systems. And so I envision this future, which I think is about right, but we'll see with a lot of variations on different themes here, is in general, very broad statement, smaller, cheaper, more disposable, swarming, and autonomous systems. And then with autonomy comes AI-enabled autonomy. There is a tendency to conflate autonomous systems and AI-enabled autonomy. Two very different things. There are a lot of autonomous systems in DoD today. There are very few, and I would say really no significant AI-enabled autonomous systems. That's where I think we're going to see some of these big capabilities come together. And when I think about this, Dave, I think of this future of right now it's big H, human, and in a lot of cases, small m, machine. And that will begin to rebalance. So smaller h, bigger m, and then in some aspects, it'll be machine to machine, big M, with humans somewhere in there helping, in the decision-making loop. How do you get there? It's the idea of human machines working together. And this is where some of our relationships with AFRL and the Air Force have been very, very valuable and productive. And by the way, Cap Rogers says hi. We just exchanged emails over the weekend on this very subject about the work he's doing to try to field on Billy Mitchell's anniversary in July of next year, an autonomous system to go up against a human manned system in some sort of air-to-air. Bold idea. And probably not a lot of AI in the beginning of that, because this is, again, back to the foundational elements. You've got to solve for a lot of variables in the calculus known as AI-enabled autonomy. But I'm confident that's the sort of thing that will make a big difference over time, is human-machine working together. Ben, back to Kasparov in losing against Deep Blue. It wasn't the human or the machine. It was the human and machine working together with great processes that beat anybody. That's what I think this is going to be about. This idea of a quarterback. You've talked about this. Will Roper talks a lot about it. A human, maybe it's a manned airplane that's quarterbacking a lot of autonomous swarming systems. I think the only failure we'll have is failure of imagination. Anything's on the table. What we have to do is just throw a bunch of ideas out there, go after them, see what fails, and throw that aside and tell Congress, look, this is going to happen, right? We're going to spend money, and we're just going to say it's sunk cost, move on to the next program. These are big ideas, but I think these are where the future is going to be in this idea of AI-enabled autonomous systems and also just human-machine teaming for the next decade.
Great insights. Another joint AI center responsibility is to integrate DoD's AI development, which includes addressing key policies, processes, and relationships to ensure its long-term success and stability, which is kind of a follow-on to your last answer or remarks. Could you address progress toward DoD policy on the lethal use of future autonomous weapon systems, such as AI-generated precision-guided munitions and armed uninhabited aircraft?
Yeah, again, when I go back to the concept of the JAIC, what I'm proud of is forming an organization that has elements including strategy and policy. And I hired somebody just to come in and lead our AI ethics effort. And she's running under our governance structure, an AI subcommittee called Responsible Champions for AI to go after these policy questions. And we're not trying to do it in isolation. I have a group of people focused on it, but OSD policy is core to this discussion as all the legal elements of all the services. This quickly gets into big legal questions. And the founding document right now is the DOD Directive 3000.09, Autonomy and Weapons Systems. It was really written in a pre-AI world, but it still works up to this point for addressing those questions of autonomous systems and AI-enabled autonomy. And then it gives sort of a process by which you would have to go to develop capabilities that could be fully autonomous weapon systems all the way to test and evaluation of those and then actual fielding. And as you know, that anything we're talking about, the core concept, first of all, we have AI ethics principles Secretary Esper signed out based on the tremendous work the Defense Innovation Board had done over the course of almost a year and a half coming out and looking at ethics. So we have the sort of grounding in sort of this principles of ethics that we're not going to go out there and just use these things without the standard foundational elements of law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, jus ad bellum, jus in bello, I mean, all those things. We take that into account from the very beginning. So I'm actually proud of the fact that we're going to address this, but we have to address it. In fact, we're now starting to sense that we're going to be far enough along in our joint warfighting mission initiative that we're going to have to sit down and do a few test cases of 3000.09 to work our way through what is acceptable in the field. You know, Bob Work and I are of one mind on this idea of, we get accused in the department of going after killer robots. No commander, you have been a commander, you wouldn't want robots with self-agency to indiscriminately out on the battlefield making life and death decisions, right? That would not happen. You would have rules of engagement, you would have spins, all these other things we do for a living, we'll take those into account. But it is adapting fast enough that we have to look at the ethical use of artificial intelligence, which includes weapons employment. I mean, we are using autonomous systems in weapons today. Now, what does that world look like? So I think we're going to lead, we're not only going to lead the government, we're going to lead the world in these conversations, because what I don't want to happen is have China take over this conversation and say the right things, but do something entirely different. And we know that would be the case.
Yes, sir. Well, before we open the session for questions from those who are listening in, let me ask you a final question on budget concerns.
Yeah.
It's a pretty safe bet that the defense budget is going to remain flat or could decline significantly depending upon the outcome of the election in November, as well as the responses to the COVID-19 environment. Are resources now provided for DoD's AI development initiatives sufficient to gain the advantages that we need over our competitors?
Yeah, to me, I do use the word, it is inevitable that budgets are going to be cut for the department. When you look at the probably pushing $3 trillion spent in coronavirus response efforts, I don't know how the DoD budgets remain that they've been, which have been relatively healthy for, I mean, to say $700+ billion, that is healthy. So now we're into this idea of a watershed moment. Is it a wake-up call for all of us to say we have to make hard decisions about investments in the future? So let me start by saying, first of all, I'm proud that we worked our way through the predictable funding profile that we need to do. We were going to be funded year to year, which is a disaster as far as I'm concerned. If you're trying to transform, you've got to have a predictable budget, and we did. We've got a $1.3 billion over 5. Very, very impressive. Very happy with that. So that was part of the solution. But now, as a department, we can't keep funding everything. So are there some big decisions? I think this is really what your heart of your question is. Big decisions about beginning to divest those legacy systems and put more into this emerging and disruptive technology. This is the thesis of Chris Brose's book of Kill Chain. It's that very question of we can't do it all, so what do we do? What we can't afford to do is do it all the way we've been doing, plowing the money into the old and sort of just enough funding on the new to keep it going. And I'm not saying that legacy systems go away overnight. I mean, the last thing I would ever claim is carriers and fighters and satellites are going away in the next couple of years. It's what's the right mix? What's the balance? Can we make everything better and more efficient and effective by AI-enabled capabilities, by putting 5G on board and those? I think what we're seeing is we take the software mindset, it will be less of the legacy and put some big bets down. And they're big bets, and they're not risk-free bets. But when we look at China and Russia, and especially China, where they're investing, I almost say we can't afford to do it any other way. We've got to build toward that AI-enabled force of the future, or I think we have an unacceptably high risk of losing, and we're not used to doing that.
Well, Jack, thanks very much for your insights today. On behalf of AFA's Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power Studies, we really wish you all the best as you transition AI-enabled capabilities to maintain America's strategic and operational advantage. And as you yourself transition into the future, we wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you. And thank you for what you've been doing in and out of uniform to advance probably the most important cause of all right now is the future of our warfighting force.
Thanks for that, Jack. Now, as a reminder to our listeners, the next event in our series will be with Dr. Will Roper, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. That's going to be next Tuesday, June 9th. Jack, what we're going to do now is open the session to questions from the audience who've been listening to our conversation. As a reminder to those in the audience, please use the computer function to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then state your name and your organization. And it looks like the first one with their hand up is Sydney Freeberg. Over to you, Sydney.
Hi, Sydney.
Hello, sir. Gentlemen, thank you very much for doing this. Very high concentration of intellectual firepower today. But wanted to ask, you mentioned the idea of stitching systems together. In other words, instead of one ring to rule them all, one standard, one architecture, we try to actually, as you say, play the nail where it lies and figure out how to get all these things to work together without ripping them all out and starting over. I know DARPA's Mosaic folks are very much into that concept. Even actually have a program called Stitches, which I imagine you may be working with. And I'm curious, technically, how do you do that? It's one thing to say we need to get all these systems to intercommunicate, but the reason why people went for Big Bang FCS style one system to rule them all in the past was it was so hard to get the legacy to communicate. So how do you patch that? How do you stitch that? Is there a technology that exists today that maybe didn't 20 years ago that makes this possible to get the legacy to work, to play nicely with each other?
Yeah, Sydney, those technologies I'm confident do exist today. Now, am I the right technical subject matter expert to tell you exactly what they look like? No, but Nan Mulchandani is and has drawn out a map of what this looks like. I think what we've fallen victim to in the past is trying to do too much too fast and change an entire weapon system and sort of, that famous, I don't know what the cartoon was, you got all these equations and then a miracle happens and then your product's delivered. There are no miracles here. We have to focus on the foundational elements. The sort of hard, almost I'd say grunt work of building out what does data need to look like. Let's define what AI ready is. Both on the people side, but to your question on the weapon system side, and then build out the architecture to adapt to that sort of requirement of AI ready and what commercial best practices are today. I look at the world as it exists today in every big company. Now, all the big companies are not interoperable because they have their own proprietary pieces of it, but they have solved this problem to a 90th percentile. What the department needs to do is figure out how to rebuild sort of our architecture to match what is best practice today in industry. I think we got lots of examples of it at small scales in the department. In the research side of it, like as you said, stitches. We were looking at stitches. We were hoping we could be one of the first programs to bring over from R&D, accelerate that into production. It's been hard to do. Wasn't quite ready to transition yet. So both on the department side, finding those programs that are working on this architecture piece and seeing can we accelerate them, at the same time going after what is best practice in commercial industry, and then bringing those in as we build out. As you're aware, we're building the Joint Common Foundation. We will have, I think, an award here within the next couple of weeks, or maybe a little bit longer than that, on bringing an integrator together to build out that foundation, who understands all the different companies' capabilities that will be brought to bear against the JCF to build out that platform or that AI, ML, DevOps environment on top of that cloud enterprise solution architecture for the department. And I'm confident that is doable, but it's going to require a lot of reworking across the rest of the department. And I look forward to you and Nan spending a little bit more time together. When he builds his vision out, he's already beyond the AI vision. Is what do we need to do to make it a software company for the Department of Defense? The Air Force has embarked very, very aggressively in this area in Cloud One and Platform One, and we're partnering with them as we're waiting for JEDI to be resolved. So we're already building towards that future that I've been talking about, but we're in pretty early steps on this. So I guess what I'd say is, let's not try to solve it all simultaneously. As I said, Lieutenant General Schwedo had a note of things to go solve, which we couldn't solve over the past 40 years. We're not going to solve in the next 6 months. Let's do a different look at this. Let's start over and define what a commercial architecture looks like and build to that. Problem is now we're trying to bring in all these other legacy systems on top of it. That's where the challenges come in, is integrating legacy into new. Extraordinarily difficult to do for the department.
Okay, Rachel Cohen.
Hi, sir. Thanks for doing this. This is Rachel Cohen with Air Force Magazine.
Hi, Rachel.
I know this is in Cap Rogers lane, but you brought it up, so I figured I would follow up on it. As far as I know, when they started thinking about, autonomous versus manned, air-to-air, whatever they wanted to build 2 years ago, they were envisioning a fighter jet. So I was hoping that you could kind of update us on, what you know of that project, and sort of how it's evolved and, what they've learned. I mean, as AI has evolved in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about the current status. It'd be a good question for Will Roper when he comes in, I think next week, to talk in the same forum about the latest on. When I was exchanging notes with Cap over the weekend, it was more on the, okay, here, what's the AI-enabled part of that autonomous future? I think what you're tickling a little bit, though, which is a very interesting question. A lot of people have pondered over the past couple of decades is, where do we really need a human at all in these systems? And are we trying to build the next manned fighter as opposed to building a system with the best possible capability for the environment it will face in, say, an Indo-Pacific? And so there's this, it's a little bit, maybe not the best analogy, but if you look at sort of the MQ-9 ground control station, are you trying to make that really look like an F-16 cockpit, or just the most functional use of a keyboard and a couple other things, because that's what the world has evolved to? What we have to do is sort of take a different mindset of people who've grown up differently than a lot of people like me who've got 3.5 decades in this, and I'm got all the old bad habit patterns of sort of what I grew up with. It's taking a much different view where I have no longer G-limited, or maybe I shouldn't be thinking about a 65-foot wingspan. Maybe it is a small autonomous swarming capability, but then I've got to solve for battery. I've got to solve for size, weight, and power problems, which are always going to be a short-term challenge. But we should also be taking the best of the lessons coming out of the commercial car industry And I like talking about this because it's a cautionary tale. 10 companies, I think the number is, and about 13 or $17 billion over the last decade, and there is no level 4 fully autonomous vehicle out on the roads today. Cautionary tale. On the other hand, that's a decade worth of experience we should be pulling into the military because they've learned so much. I think it's less about level 4 autonomy and all the other lessons they're learning by building those capabilities out. It's going to be the same. You know, Cap's probably going to have a hard time getting to that flight next year in a fully where the machine beats the human. But go back to DARPA Grand Challenge. Who finished in that first DARPA Grand Challenge? Nobody. Nobody came close. I think about not even a mile down the road. But how much has played out since then? This is less about sort of that success of beating a human in 2021. If he does it, great. Now it's a record all by itself. But learning about what does it take to build a different kind of system, not the one we're used to building in the past.
Well, General Shanahan, thanks again. We are coming up on the end of our allocated hour. You've given the audience some significant and very great insight into all the work that you and your team have accomplished. And once again, thanks for doing that, and all the best in the future. And please stay in touch.
Well, thanks very much for allowing me to come in. As I hope I communicated a sense of passion for this. It needs people with passion who are willing to take risks and not always get it right. But I don't think we have any choice anymore. This is a future environment that's very different than anything since 2001. And we've got to treat it very differently. So thanks for the opportunity. And I hope I did toss a few ideas that people can think about. And when you get Will Roper in, you can tackle him because his IQ is at least 3 times mine. And he'll be ready to talk about all these things in some detail. So thanks, Dave, very much. And thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Have a great aerospace power kind of day.
Thank you. You too. See you.